All right, here we go. We are live. Go for it, Corey.
All right. So, welcome everybody to another Flameless
Okay.
Fireside tonight.
We'll just sit here.
We have a very interesting guest tonight. That would be Everett. He's on the moon. So it takes a little while for the radio signal to get to the moon and back. As you can tell, it takes him a minute to laugh at my jokes. So his radio frequency is a bit far. So we're gonna forgive him if he chimes in a little late. But we want to welcome everybody to this Flameless Fireside tonight. I'm your host, and because Everett is a bit delayed somewhere in time. So, but I'd like to welcome Joyce, and I'd like to welcome Katie, who will be co-hosting tonight. Katie is going to be our guest of honor, who she has a lot of experience, at least in the medical side, and a little bit of counseling, and she'll be able to lend us some very good knowledge in this topic that we have tonight. And this is a very interesting topic. So the topic tonight is going to be intimacy and relationships. And we've had this discussion before, but it's been almost a year, I think. And but let's talk about sex. You know, we probably in the last year we probably had a couple of hundred new divorcees added to the group. People like, people who've gotten divorced in the last year and are trying to find, what's going on and how to figure this stuff out and how the dating scene's going. And hopefully you'll find some answers and solace in this group. It's a very good group. Also, if you guys are on YouTube or Facebook, go ahead and like us. Go in and like us. If you're on YouTube, click the subscribe, click the notification button so that you'll get notified whenever we have new streams that come up. Also, if you are on Facebook, like our page, and then you should get updates on that if you're streaming on Facebook. So, all right, let's get to the topic because I'm sure everybody's tired of hearing all the intros. And so, Katie, welcome tonight.
It seems like I mostly get invited back every time we bring up the sex topic.
I wonder what. No.
Probably people willing to talk about it.
Well, tell us a little bit about you, background. Some people may not have met you before.
Okay, so I'm Katie Jangwis. I'm a nurse practitioner. I have a doctorate in nursing practice, and I work. I do a lot of women's health, a lot of counseling, a lot of mental health, a lot of family practice. Contraception, all that stuff. So anyway, I do talk about sex a lot with teenagers too, with adults, with everybody. And I have a lot of experience. I've been in the dating world for 4 years. I'm now stepping out of the dating world, but I've been through it all. Yeah, thanks, Tris. So I've had, this situation hundreds of times about, do we talk about sex? At what point does it get to be too much versus the conversations that are necessary?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, thank you for being here tonight with us, and we'll answer the questions. And Joyce, were you around when we did this topic last time?
Actually, it's really interesting because one of the very first Flameless Fireside podcasts that I watched was with John Brailsford when he gave, it was like a 3-part series. Mm-hmm. And I felt like it was so beneficial to me because as a single person and as you kind of venture into dating, it's hard to know where the right balance is because there are people who want to talk about it right away and to some degree inappropriately and in a place that makes you a little bit uncomfortable. But I think that it's a really essential thing to talk about. Unlike Katie, I don't talk about it at all at work. Like only when we're doing an investigation into someone who's done something wrong. I work in human resources. And so then we'll talk about it, but like, it's not something we talk about. But I think it's essential. And I especially think that in a church we're very clear about the boundaries of, sex is appropriate within marriage. I think we have to be really careful because I think some people grow up feeling like sex is bad or sex is wrong. And so we can't talk about it. And in reality, sex is wonderful. It's just the Lord put some really strict rules about where It can happen.
Yeah.
And so if we don't talk about it, we got to sort of ferret out how other people feel about that. And if we're at the same place as they are, because I'm sure there are lots of people who don't enjoy it. And there are some who enjoy it very much. And you just have to know, is this something that makes you compatible, or is it going to be a problem in the future? So you got to talk about it. And I just think it's really important that we figure out what's the best way to talk about it.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think that there's it's unfortunate, but this has nothing to do with the church. And this is a topic we've talked about before, about the difference between gospel doctrine and church culture. Mm-hmm. So, or I would call cultural commandments. And so what happens is well-intended people, whether they be bishops, stake presidents, parents, whatever, they feel so worried about the youth and sexuality that it almost comes off like they're putting a stigma, and it almost comes off as just it's evil. It's a necessary evil to have babies and to procreate, and it can get lost, and there could be a lot of false information. I'd hate to say false doctrine because that's not my place, but it could be a lot of stuff could be put out that's not true. That we need to cut through that. So we might talk about some of that tonight. I know that it's a weird thing because when you're growing up and you're trying to stay chaste and get ready for your missions and get ready for the temple marriage, that we're just so like, we got to stay away from sex. It's so bad if I have it and I screw up, and then all of a sudden, bam, it's honeymoon night and sex is okay. And it's like, how do you switch that? Have you ever seen that, Katie, with some of the youth? Have you worked with people that have had that struggle?
So mostly I've seen that with the men that I've dated, and they had sexual problems in their relationship. So like maybe a 20-year marriage where the wife or the husband only felt comfortable having sex to procreate because they felt like that was the only time it was acceptable. And so their sex life was maybe dry or unadventurous, or they always felt just slightly uncomfortable, and it caused a lot of relationship issues because physical touch is a love language for many people. So if there's not cohesion and comfortableness with that physical touch, it can really break down the marriage a lot. And that's one of the reasons it's important to talk about it before starting a relationship, so that if you're not compatible, then you can get that out right away. And but there's I remember in Young Women's, when I was a teenager, there was this analogy repeated several times, like, if you have sex before marriage, it's like chewing up a piece of gum. Do you want to pass that around? Nobody wants that gum after that, So there was just so much shame around it. And I think that's so damaging. And what we need to realize is, like what you said, it's not doctrinal, it's cultural. And the Sunday school teachers, the youth teachers, the bishops, the stake presidents, they're not counselors. They're not teachers. We or they or the collective, everybody haven't been trained on how to talk about this stuff in an appropriate way. But like Joyce said, God created it, and he created it to feel good, and he created it to be an expression of love. So we need to not feel shame around it.
Yep. I agree.
Well, and I think that when we have those good, appropriate conversations, sometimes we can confront some of those beliefs that people have come, to that place in their life, to that, approaching marriage and believing that, well, we can't talk about it and it's this. And I think it can be, if it's handled sensitively, it can be really exploratory in terms of, things, what you might think is comfortable and what you think would be gross or whatever. And I think it's a responsibility before you go into a marriage to make sure that that you're open with what you feel, and that you kind of make sure you understand what your partner feels. And again, like it's a challenging subject, because I've talked to people who didn't want to just talk about how we feel about sex, the role of sex, they just wanted to talk about sex. And it could get really uncomfortable. I mean, I like it. Like I had somebody today, they said, how many times can Joyce talk about sex? And I'm like, it's not really how many times, it's how many times you do without blushing, because it's not something that comes easily for me.
Yeah.
So.
And I look
It's
at it this way
important.
too. We are a church. We are a church of converts. We are a church of reactivation. And so I think we have to be careful how we judge. You know, if you walked in the church one day and you saw a beautiful young man or young lady and they had tattoos, would you think to yourself like, oh, I wish that person would have read the scriptures a little harder before they made that decision to get tattoos? Or would you think in your mind, maybe they're a convert and they're like 2 months old in the church and they got those tattoos before they found the church?
Or
And I
they
think we have
left
to think,
and recovered and came back.
or they left, got tattoos, and then said, you know what, I made a huge mistake. I'm going back to church. And I think that in the world we live in, I mean, that could be somebody who did the same thing. Somebody could have been active and then just bam, got back in the church. They're an amazing person. And okay, they had sex before marriage. Is that going to be a deal killer? Is that going to be something where you're like, oh my gosh, you know? So,
Well,
you know,
and I also think like it could be someone who's active in church. It could be someone who's trying their very best,
exactly.
but finds themselves in a situation where things just went too far. They were prepared, they weren't prepared for kind of the feelings that they would have or whatnot. And so, you know, we have to be able to recognize that repentance was part of the plan. You know, the Lord knew we would make mistakes. And so that idea of you're like a chewed up piece of gum, that's just so wrong.
I know.
Because the same thing could be said about any sin. And that's not the way the Savior sees it. You know, that's not like he had love and compassion for a woman who was an adulteress. Like he didn't, you know, cast her out. He loved her. And so I think it's really important for us to treat people that way. But I do think it's important to know what other people's experience has been so that we can figure out if we're compatible. And I mean, I'm not saying we need a head count. I just think people really need to know, you know, do you have a lot of experience? Do you have no experience? Like where do you stand? And then how do you feel about it?
And preface that with like, I'm not making a judgment call here. If you slept with 20 people, I'm not making a judgment call. That's in your past. And you have to kind of wrap your mind around it. And all of us are divorced. So all of us have had sex. Like
not all of us.
Not
all of us are divorced, right? So.
Well, true, Joyce. That's true. But I mean, the ones who are divorced have, you know, we have some experience with it. But we've all come from away with like different experiences. We've had people who've been married to people who struggled with same-sex attraction. That could have put a damper on their sex life. It could have affected their mental capacities just after going. Sorry, I almost said después. I almost like flip the Spanish. Why? That's so weird. My brain just.
I'll follow your lead.
have to switch to Spanish.
I know. Right?
But after the divorce, you're like, you know, my spouse was gay and I didn't, you know, realize it, and now I don't feel like, why was that person with me? And it can cause a lot of things. So those are some things you might bring into another relationship that probably should be discussed.
When I was working with a gal that had a lot of sexual trauma, and she had zero interest in a sexual relationship in a marriage, but she had so much interest in a marriage, you know, and she knew that really closed down her opportunities quite a bit, because most men are, you know, most people want a sexual relationship, and she would try a few times with relationships, but as soon as anything got physical, even a makeout, she'd just go into this PTSD response. And so she luckily was aware that it was an issue, and that she, you know, and we talked about, you know, how to approach that. But I think that, and I don't know if you guys have come across this, but when you start dating somebody or talking to somebody, those first few days when you're talking to somebody, the people that had a pretty frigid relationship that was not their choice, but somebody else's choice, they want to talk about it pretty soon. They want to bring it up pretty quick, because they don't want to start emotionally investing into somebody that's not on the same page. And I think, Joyce, you were talking about earlier that sometimes it's like too early, too soon, too much. But I also think it's important to validate that it's something, it's just like we're checking off, do you have a job? You know, do you do drugs? You know, it's important to check off, do you like sex? And that doesn't mean it's dirty or pervy. Does it depend on how they approach it? Like if they're like, what are you wearing?
100%.
Your bra, then that's
I mean, or what kind of positions do you like? Yeah, it's a whole different story.
Or
Exactly.
or how much is okay, like that kind of thing, like before marriage, like that kind of like when it's like the third conversation that you've had with someone and they're starting to ask you those kind of boundaries, it's, you know, it can be a little bit worrisome. And so and for me, I think it really comes down to how much of the conversation is that. If most of your conversation is about that, that's, you know, for me, when that's problematic. If it's just a balanced part of the conversation, it's great.
Joyce, I tend to, sorry, Corey, did you want to say?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think this is probably totally generalization, so I apologize if it is, but I would imagine, or I think that men might bring it up a little sooner than women may be comfortable with. But I learned over time to validate what they were trying to ask, to give a short, appropriate response, and then redirect the conversation so that it didn't just keep snowballing. So I would be like, no, yes, I enjoyed sex in my marriage. We had a very healthy sexual relationship. We had regular sex, on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. Once we get to know each other better, we can explore that a little bit more. And then I would change the subject into something else so that they knew I was okay talking about it. I just didn't want to talk about it right now. And I had the kind of a 2-strike policy. Like if they redirected well, that was a good sign to me. Right. If they came right back to it pretty quick or even the next day and they kept bringing it up, so I would redirect it again, say, no, I think that's a good subject. I think it's important. I think I like it. I'm looking forward to it. And then I would change the subject. If they didn't redirect well, then I would just say, okay, they're looking for something different than I am. And if they don't respect your conversational boundaries, less likely to respect your personal boundaries.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's
true. So we have a little slideshow we can bring up and we can kind of go through a little bit about it. I
think, Corey, one thing I wanted to say about the slide thing, and we can kind of go probably one slide at a time, but I think that one of the challenges is that not only do we not know how to talk about it, but I think sometimes, and this goes back to what are we taught, and what is appropriate, because there are people out there who literally do think it's only appropriate to have sex if you're trying to have kids. And, I'm past that. So I mean, there's a point in life when you're not going to have kids. And so is it appropriate? Why would you even do that? And so I think what was great about this article and sort of this information is that it really does address in a very good way, sort of how to think about some of those things. So.
Oh, I agree. So, look at the first one here. We're just kind of talking about ask a Latter-day Saints therapist, or what is important, about marriage. And there's just a few quotes here that we've kind of highlighted that, the question is, in God's eyes, what's appropriate and not appropriate in a marriage bedroom? And then we have a quote here from Spencer W. Kimball that says, men and women join in a process of creation and an expression of love. And so, but I think also on the next slide, it talks a little bit about that sexuality is for building bonds of love between husband and wife. So it's not just about, hey, procreation, let's have a baby, so let's have lots of sex. And then as soon as you're pregnant, it's over. That's never been a standard. And here it says, think of that. So sex in marriage isn't just something we do to make babies, nor is it something we're allowed to do now that we're married. It talks a little bit about how, that it actually can build love and bonds between people the more you participate in that. It's probably the most intimate thing that two human beings can do. And it can actually emotionally and spiritually bond a person together. So I don't know, Katie, if you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I talk to women a lot about libido. They're frustrated that their libido is just gone. They, their partner approaches them and they're like, oh, and it kind of goes along with what I just read there, that it's not, it's, so I tell these women, and this is kind of what I feel about sex in marriage, is that it's an act of love, just like making dinner is. just like, cleaning up the house. It's sometimes people may not be in the mood, but it's a show of love. It's a show of appreciation. So I think it's important to try to match your partner's energy. It doesn't always mean that, one person may always have kind of a higher drive than the other person. It doesn't mean you always have to, go with it. But if you think about it as an act of love and a way to tighten those bonds together, then it takes on a different meaning than just sexual gratification. And I think that it's the same in how we view it, that it's not, it's to strengthen that relationship. It's a huge love language. And I think it's very problematic when it's not being used as a love language.
Well, and I also think one of the things that's interesting is in the article, it talked about the fact that the church, there was a time in which they kind of said, here are things that are okay and here are things that are not. And they've really moved away from that position. And I think it's really important to note that there isn't and I think, again, this goes back to what were we taught? How do we feel about that? And could be parents taught this. I mean, it may not be your young women leaders, and, it may be parents who are teaching this, but I think that it's important to note that the church doesn't say that there's anything in particular that is just categorically wrong, as long as it's not, abusive, as long as it's not something that's making the other person feel coerced or who is feeling
or
subjugated And so I think, that's like, really, it's about exploring and figuring things out, kind of what works for each of you. But I love that it really does come down to two people, and what is comfortable for both of them.
Nowadays,
that happened to me and so I got married, young at 22, and my wife at the time, and we were married for 22 years. We actually had a very healthy sex life, and it was not, there was no issues in that area. But when we first got married, we had talked about like things that we like to do and positions or whatever. And then we got to thinking like, well, what if there's something that we're doing that we're not supposed to be doing? So we went and talked to the bishop, and the bishop gave us like some great advice. And it was like the best advice I'd heard ever from a bishop. And he just said, you're allowed to do whatever you both feel comfortable doing. And that was his advice. He says, but you both have to be okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
My bishop gave me that advice too, but he added, and I think this is important in the cultural environment we have now, he added, but try to keep the world out of your bedroom. Like, so as long as you're both comfortable with what you're doing. And right now, I mean, I don't know how it is you're in Texas, right, Corey?
Arizona.
Arizona. And Joyce, you're East Coast?
I'm in Maryland. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maryland. And
East Coast.
So here in Utah, there's like in the LDS community, there's a huge swinger community and like open relationship community in the LDS,
that was happening when I lived there in 2005. I heard about that. Yeah.
I was probably just blind to it before then, because now I know about it. And so I think when you go too far with the world's view of what's okay and what's not, I mean, if you're both okay with bringing in a third, I don't think that's really what that bishop would be meaning. That's very destroying to a relationship.
Well, that's not a marriage. That's not a marriage sexuality in a marriage. So,
well, and because that is like you've made covenants. If you've made covenants or promises of baptism, that would be breaking those covenants. If you're like inviting someone,
that's pretty not a gray area. That's not a gray line. It's a pretty bright line. No. You would know, like,
right. So we're not married to this.
We're not married to this person, and But it's weird how the human brain is so weird. Like, at least with my job, I get to study a little bit of psychology about people, and it's just amazing how people rationalize. And yeah, with my job, I help people rationalize to confess, but it's amazing how people can really rationalize. They'll say, well, we're both married, so therefore we're free to exercise our sexuality, and therefore a threesome would be okay as long as we're both okay with it. And then somehow in their mind, they're rationalizing that they're married, and therefore everything that's sexual is available to you. And it's weird how the brain rationalizes. So I'm sure there's groups of people out there that say, oh yeah, I have no problem swinging or whatever, because, you know, that's my rationalization.
Right. So with my fiance, when we were talking about where we are at on our sexual spectrum, because everybody's on a spectrum, we both kind of agreed, okay, exploration and adventure is great as long as we don't bring in a third party and we keep like porn out of our relationship.
Yep.
And that's, I don't know if this is the right segment for this or not, but it's something I was thinking a lot before we came on to this is I've seen so many people on our, like the LDS singles site or like the conversation threads that say, I don't ever want to marry somebody who watches porn or, you know, has had an addiction in the past or has had sex outside of marriage or those things. And I think part of success in being able to date and find your person is one, being vulnerable and honest about where you're at on the spectrum, and two, being compassionate and empathetic in where they've been, but also knowing yourself enough to know what can I accept and what can I not. And I'm not validating or condoning, like I don't think there's any healthy level of porn, but I think human nature is that, I don't know what the statistic is. I saw it's 90-something% of men might look at porn sometimes. That's not the same as a porn addiction. But if I said I will never marry anybody who's ever looked at porn, I'll probably be single most of my life. You know, like, but so I think, but there's also never a healthy level of French fries. There's not a healthy level of soda. Like, but we tend to think that if this carnal craving is sexual in nature, it's a character flaw. But really, it's human nature. It's a carnal craving, just like a whole lot of chocolate is, you know? So I think we need to evaluate never, like, you know, and just evaluate their person, like who they are. How do they address this? Like, yes, I've looked at porn a few times, maybe a few times a year or a decade or whatever, a quarter, who knows, you know, and just evaluate, am I okay with that level? Is that something that if we're married, would that change? You know, those kinds of conversations I think are very important.
Exactly. And I think that as LDS, as if we are truly people who follow Christ and we understand the atonement and we understand repentance and we understand forgiveness, if we truly understand that, right? And we know what the Savior said about if we want to be forgiven for our faults, that we're commanded to give forgiveness to others, right? And so, yeah, I mean, you're gonna run into people that have struggled. I mean, divorce is horrible, and for some people, it just messes with them emotionally, mentally. Some people like are bitter. They step away from the church for a while. Then they come to their senses. They get counseling. They realize, I should have stepped away from the church. I want to come back. And then, you know, they've got a history. And are you going to judge them? Are you going to say they might be the most amazing person that you'd ever meet, and this is the person that you could be with for eternity? And you're going to say, oh, you screwed up during your single life? Yeah, I'm just not going to. Sorry. It's not for me.
Yeah.
Well, and because whatever the, you know, like it could be that you messed up financially and you're kind of in a bad place. It could be that, you know, you had some kind of a addiction. Maybe you were an alcoholic at some point, you know, and there are lots of different things that we could have been through. I think the important question is, when you're approaching a relationship, can you be honest about where you are? I mean, if someone's in an active porn addiction, like this, you know, it's not a good place to start a new relationship. That has to be something that you can acknowledge, that you can work on, that you can change. I think that that's really important. But, you know, if we can't forgive others for the things that they've done that, you know, we wish they hadn't done, you know, we're always going to find ourselves in the same exact position. There are going to be things they wish we hadn't done.
And you're always going to be nitpicking everything, right? It always reminds me, I call it the Jerry Seinfeld syndrome, right? Whenever I watch Seinfeld, like Jerry Seinfeld always found a fault in a woman.
Yeah.
Always like,
and then hyper-focus on it.
Yeah, he had man hands, low talker, high talker, ate peas with a fork, or, you know, just always had something going on, you know?
Yeah. And Joyce, I think also it's important to clarify addiction versus use. Because I think
Good
a
point.
porn
Yeah, good
addiction
point.
is very different than occasional porn use. And I'm, again,
Agreed.
not condoning.
Agreed.
I'm just
Yep.
saying different people have different triggers. Different people have different, uses.
Well, and I know that there are people who can, it's who can drink alcohol and they just have a drink occasionally. And there are other people who either they drink too much or they just don't drink at all because they know they can't keep themselves from it. I'm the same way with sugar. So, yeah. So, but yeah, and I think like we have to ourselves identify where those problems are, for ourselves, because you're right. Like there are people who are clearly addicted and there are others who just use it occasionally and maybe they think that's okay. And you might think it's not okay, but again, you won't know that unless you're having a conversation and being really honest about it.
And I saw a statistic that it's on the rise amongst women. It's believe it or not, it's on the rise.
So is affairs. So is sex outside of marriage. So I mean, women are getting, and I don't know if it's getting there. Or they're just more open about it or what. I don't know. But yes, I think anything we could apply to men at this point, we can apply to women on the same level. And and somebody mentioned that, I'm sorry, I was not in the group chat thing, so I didn't see some of the comments coming through, but there was somebody was talking about forgiving people's past, and not holding it against them. Timothy was saying if the Lord can forgive them, we should forgive them. So I don't know if you guys have come across this in your dating, but there's some people I've gone out with, and within the first date or two, they'll just very transparently say, I did have an affair on my wife, or, something. And they give me a pretty good background of when it happened. It was one time. They were so remorseful. They went to the bishop, they fixed it. And then there's a whole nother group of people that have like a whole hoe phase after their divorce for a while, because they're having some testimony issues and some, is it all worth it issues and stuff. But so, we need to recognize, one, their vulnerability, and two, is this something that would bother me the rest of our marriage if we were to, or is it something that they put in their past and I can leave in their past without it coming up?
Yeah. I think for me, I don't care. I'd rather get to know the person at the moment I met them and not bring in their past, because now I've just entangled their past into my start and beginning of a relationship with somebody. Because I'd like to get to know them of who they are today, because the person I'm meeting is the sum of all their good and bad mistakes, or their good deeds and their bad mistakes. Like they're the sum of that. So they've learned, they've grown, all the things have made them that person that made me attracted to them. So why would I then say, oh, you had sex with 3 guys, or, or, oh my gosh, I just think that's just so weird. Not that it would bother me, but to me, I just would not want that person to feel like they have to then reconfess and then retell me the stories that they just got over with, Now, I personally would like to know if fidelity is an issue, because, that was something that I was affected by my marriage, and it was something that it hurt me the most, and that's why I was divorced. It was something that I think that if I found out after we got married, or we were deep into the relationship and they said, oh, by the way, I cheated on my husband, I'd be like, I think that would probably, be hard for me I can get over it, but it'd take me a little bit to kind of swallow that,
Well, and there's something about bringing it up at the beginning and taking ownership for it that creates some trustworthiness, right? Yeah. If they own it, they are remorseful about it, they fixed it, and then moving forward, there's that responsibility is trustworthy to me. But like you said, if they bring it up way down the road when you're emotionally invested, to me, that's a lack of trustworthiness.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that Corey, in terms of, you want to just know the person as they are. I have worked with youth a lot, and one of the things I always felt like I brought to the table was that I don't know everything about them. I don't know how long they wet their beds. I mean, I don't know if they still pick their nose. Like, I don't know all of that stuff, and I don't need to. And I can love them because I know who they are now. I know kind of the people that they are. I don't have to know all of that. And so I hadn't really thought about it from a dating perspective, but I like the idea that, there are some critical things that we should know. And often with youth, there are things that we need to know because of, we want to steer clear of things that were difficult for them, or if they're family situation is something, but we don't have to know all of those details in order to love them. And and I think that there's something powerful about that, saying, I accept that you had a past, and that past is what made you who you are. So I think that that's,
and I think those thoughts would come in my mind, like it would pollute my mind. It would be like, I'd be like, oh, so she was with 5 guys, 10 guys, 1 guy, whatever. It would just be now I'm going into this make-believe past that I never saw, I never experienced with her. So why would I want that even in my head? So I would just be like, you know what? You got to pass. I got to pass. But today we start. Today we start together and we move forward, And
I think it's important to talk about the things that are hard, that we really, we need to be able to talk about that, because it will enter into the relationship. So we have a couple of questions that I think we had kind of thought about and talked a little bit about. So it would be really, I think, interesting to hear this. Like, Corey, your thoughts on what misconceptions do men have about women and sex? And certainly we'd love to get comments from the listeners.
So what misconceptions do men have about women and sex? I think that the misconception is that men want sex more than women want sex. That is a misconception.
Really?
I think men think, oh man, I can get sex all the time I want, and women just want romance sex, and guys just want to get in there and get it done sometimes. And that's the misconception. I think women like sex just as much as men. I think women are shy about it. I think women are worried they'll be judged for wanting more sex than their male partner. So I think that's a misconception. And I think women unfortunately, they fall into that trap too.
Well, and Katie, your thoughts on that? Like, do you think Corey's right, or do you think there are other misconceptions that men have about women?
Well, so I'm kind of surprised about how his misconceptions, because even as a provider and as a woman who really enjoys sex, I kind of tend to think that men in general have I do not have statistics to back me up, but I would think that in most relationships, men have the higher sex drive than women.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean they just want animalistic, quick, get in and get out. That doesn't mean they don't want romance too. They do.
Yeah.
But I would say that in many relationships, and maybe that's a misconception. I don't know, guys, anybody on here that wants to weigh in, but I would think that in most romantic relationships, men have the higher drive. Because of testosterone, it's nature. Testosterone amps up that drive,
Now, the other misconception I think also that men might have is that men's sex drive is higher in their 20s and lower in their 50s, and women's are higher in their 40s and 50s. Is that a misconception?
I think that might be truth, honestly.
I think it's true too.
Again, I have statistics.
I've heard a lot of women say, oh my gosh, like either they hit menopause or they get close to hit menopause and they're like, there's something going on, but I want sex all the time. And the guy's like, oh my gosh, my testosterone's low. I'm in my 50s.
And maybe it's that once that testosterone stops to drop, they finally end up like at the same level.
Evening out.
But I do think a lot of 30, 40-year-old women start having this amped up sex drive. And honestly, what I think it is, this is me, Katie, not me, Dr. Katie, talking, is they become more comfortable with themselves. They become more comfortable with their bodies. They become more comfortable with how, So I think it's more about confidence than anything else, and that amps up the libido.
Yeah, and I think in life and in general, women, I think that's true, that women are just to the point where they just don't care about some of the stuff that they used to get wrapped up in. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of, well, I've got to be this, or I've got to do this way or whatever, like, I think you're totally right, that women just become more comfortable with this is who I am. And so take it or leave it. So,
yeah. Well, and I think in second marriages, because they're both kids often when they get married, and so they never get a real functional sex life, and then when they remarry, they're kind of at a different level, different stage, different confidence, different conceptions about themselves and other people. And so they might have a totally different outlook on sex in a second marriage than they did in the first marriage.
Yeah. All right. So the elephant in the room. Here's the elephant in the room. That's going to be a tough question for you. So I know that there in the community, some people feel like try before you buy. We know what the answer is to that, but for some people, that is a huge deal killer because can you imagine like getting on your wedding night and going, what? This was nothing but elbows and knees, and it was horrible.
Okay. Well, do you want to comment on that before I do?
Yeah, well, what I'll say is that I think that there are a lot of things that, and that was actually one of the things about the 3-part series Dr. Brailsford did, was that he talked about a lot of ways that you can figure out your compatibility without necessarily having to do the deed. And a lot of those are, like, what is the physical connection that you have with someone, like making sure that they like to touch in the same way you like to touch, that they're a giving person, that, there were just some really good things that are all about, how do you approach things in a relationship that, because I am sure many people have had their first experience on their honeymoon not be as great as they dreamed it would be. I mean, I think that happens because I think that the more you get to the intimacy in marriage isn't just sex, and I think that the more that you have that intimacy, the better the sex can be. So it's really is about, okay, so the first time you're in a hurry and it didn't go well. So kind of find ways to be more intimate in other ways so that you can make that work. So that's anyway, an uneducated opinion, but that's my
I think that when you're young, when you're young and you first get married, you're like, oh, we're in our 20s. We can practice we can practice and get better. Right. But then so a lot of people who are divorced in the church are like, I was married for 2 years or 22 years. And if sex was like really, if you guys are like, if they had a lot of sex in your marriage, then you might be really, really good at sex and you might know all the ins and outs and intimacies and touch and, all that stuff. And then somebody else might not be. Somebody might be like, no, sex in my marriage sucked. It was horrible. It was mechanical. I hated it. And so that's the discussions I think that people need to have, those discussions, like,
Oh, they totally do. And I do think like there are different stages in the dating relationship. Like some of those conversations don't have to happen right at the beginning, but some need to happen fairly early to make sure, you're on the same page with intimacy before you get too far into it. But there are other questions, and I'm going to get a little bit, I guess, clinical at this point. But it is important, like, to find out, okay, do you feel like once we're married, is oral sex on the table? Is it off the table? Because that's a big deal to some people. And to some people, they're like, no way. Are toys on the table or off the table? Because some women, just because of their anatomy and the way it's set up, they need it to have an orgasm. They can't have an orgasm without it. So those things need to be very open and communicated well, so that and that way, when intimacy is awkward, you know how to bring in variations of intimacy. And I agree with Joyce. I think most of intimacy is emotional. It is more emotional than physical, but it can also be super awkward. And then you're like, crap, now what? But I believe 100% that good sexual connection, good sexual intimacy is skill set, and you learn to develop the skill set. So if it's awkward in the beginning, it doesn't mean it'll always be. As long as both people trust each other, love each other, are comfortable with each other, and they're willing to try new things, that skill set can be adjusted until you both enjoy intimacy. But if you're willing to have options on the table.
Yeah, I've always thought that kissing is pretty intimate, right? If you both like, if you're kissing somebody and you guys just have like this dance and it just flows and it's good and there's no mistakes and you're not bumping teeth and it's just it just really, you're like, man, this is amazing. They like doing what I like and they like to do this and like do that with their, and I think that I think kissing can say a lot. I've had bad kissers and I've had good kissers. And I think in my mind, I've heard that, if the kissing is very passionate and and it looks like you guys have chemistry with the kissing, then you're probably going to have chemistry in the bed because, not that I've done compare and contrast, but I have heard that that's one way of kind of gauging that. Because I mean, I've had people who just are not good kissers, or at least maybe they are good kissers, but with me, it just, like two people trying to lead in a dance. It's like we're just not working out,
Well, and you can have an emotional connection with somebody, but then as soon as you kiss, it's like nothing turns on.
Working out. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've got to have a certain amount of chemistry that starts the motor. Because if that motor doesn't start, that's a problem.
Yeah. Agreed. Well, and I think that, one of the, we're sort of talking about this, but communication is so important. Talking about sex is one thing, but just being able to communicate. If you're with someone, you're dating someone, and you can talk about anything, I think that that's really a good sign, because then you can feel comfortable talking about sex. Then, if things don't work out well, and, like as you're kind of, that intimacy isn't going exactly how you want, you can say that, because you can talk about anything, because you built that kind of a relationship. So I think that communication is just so important. And again, not just communicating about sex, but communicating in all ways. I think that's just really important. Well, it builds a skill set that you need.
And you have to be able to ask people, do you like this? Do you not like this? Are you comfortable with this? Or are you not comfortable with that? And you can open up that communication line during dating. And I mean, in where are your lines? Like, so, I mean, I kept wondering after, I don't know, 17 years of really healthy sex, I thought, okay, if I get engaged, am I going to be able to hold that line? Because intimacy, after you've been married that long, intimacy is the whole shebang, it's everything. And so I thought, can I have a close emotional relationship with somebody and a good kissing and good chemistry and hold that line when I'm in love, after knowing, once you know what you're missing, what you're missing. And and I kept thinking, am I going to be able to be engaged without having sex? I really wasn't sure how that was going to go. And thankfully, I'm engaged to somebody that's very intentional about our communication and is saying, we need to have this line here, because if we go past this line, the motors start amping up too much, and it's really
you've gone to Rubicon. Like, this is my Rubicon. Like, there's no going back.
Yeah, and we have to keep readdressing that line of communication every time we step past just a little bit and think, okay, we need to pull it back, or else we won't make it. We won't. So we actually keep pulling our lines further and further back to make sure that we keep in the bounds that that keep us. We can keep taking the siren on Sunday. Like, keep us chaste. And it's hard. It is so hard.
Yeah.
You have to have that open communication so that are they uncomfortable? Because my line is different than his line, but I don't want to make him feel uncomfortable. So I go back to match where his line is.
I think of it like you're in the desert for a while, and then all of a sudden somebody's, here's a tall glass of drink of water, and you're like, I can't.
Right, here's a buffet.
Like, give me the water. Give me the water now. So we have a question here from. Yeah, we have a pretty good question from David.
Okay.
So when do you talk about sex in your relationship? And if you don't like what you hear, have you wasted your time? And we talked about this kind of pre-show. So let's get back to that pre-show talk we had.
Well, Corey, you had a pretty strong thought about that.
Well, so I think that it should, before somebody gets emotionally attached, emotionally committed to, like, hey, I think this is the person, this is the one I want to have an intentional relationship that possibly leads to marriage. That then, before those emotions get kind of solidified, that conversation needs to happen. So personally, myself, maybe third date, or if I really think this person is like, man, I really want to intentionally date this person, I'm gonna broach that conversation about, like, hey, look, I like you, and I think this could go somewhere, but we need to have a talk about, sex, because if this goes somewhere and it's marriage in the future, I need to know some stuff. So,
and often women interpret that as the man trying to push sexual conversation, but it's really, I think, men approach it with tact, and women receive it with tact. Like, it's a two-way street, but it's an important conversation to have. It doesn't mean we're not going to talk about sex. You have to. At each stage, there's certain levels of appropriate talk, but you've got to talk about sex at each stage.
And you might say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, to the question of, like, if you don't like if you hear something and you don't like, it doesn't work for you, have you wasted your time? I mean, that's always going to be it. Like, I think if you handle it appropriately, fairly early on, then you're going to know. But even if you've dated a little while and then you sort of find things out, it really comes down to your point of view. Like, I would like to think that any healthy dating relationship is not a waste of time. You know, hopefully we'll learn something about ourselves and learn something about others. But I think if you work it into conversations in a way that doesn't make someone uncomfortable, you can learn a lot fairly early on. So you're not spending a lot of time on someone who just isn't going to be compatible in that way.
Yeah, I think it's how you, like Katie said, it's how you present it. Like, you know, I might broach the topic of like, you know, in my marriage, we had a very healthy sex life. You know, I mean, we had a volatile marriage. I mean, and, you know, and there were some issues, but it was never like, oh, well, these things happen because there was a lack of intimacy in the bedroom. That wasn't ever the issue. There was never an issue with us ever having sex. And so, you know, I might say, you know, how was it in your marriage? Were you guys have a good sex life, or was it a bad sex life? I mean, and then I would just like to know, like, and then I would maybe mention, you know, is sex something that you like? I mean, maybe it sucked in your marriage, but is it something that you would, you know, really enjoy? Or was it traumatic? I mean, was it a traumatic experience, you know?
Yeah.
Well, we have a question from our backstage host, the one who has the really crappy internet today. And so Everett asked this question: what about guys or girls who have never been married? How do they know if someone will be sexually compatible if they don't have anything to compare it to? So I think it's a fair question. And so I think
that's a fair question for Joyce.
I was going to say, I don't think I'm the only one who can answer that question, but I do think, I think it's a really interesting question. As someone who's never been married, I think what I worry sometimes about is I don't want people to think because I haven't been married that it means I don't want that, or I don't want that kind of intimacy. Because you know, from my personal, without being too personal, our bodies were created to enjoy that. And, you know, when you're not married and you're not, you know, you haven't had that kind of experience, it doesn't mean you don't want it. In some ways, it means you want it even more, that you have to make up for lost time. And so, but how do you know if you're going to be compatible? I think it's people who are willing to talk about it, people who can, you know, ask the right kind of questions, people who are willing to hear what your perspective is. And then also like other physical indicators, like, is it someone who you feel comfortable holding their hand? And, you know, how is the kissing? How is, you know, just being close together? I think all of those things are important. But I think, you know, most bodies are gonna, you know, if it's done with someone who you really love, it's going to be great. It might take time to get to that, but if you're both committed to that, so I think, you know, the question of, do you have as much experience as your partner is just really not that important. If all these other things are lining up.
I
have a story. No, I was going to say I have a story that we can. It kind of goes along the. You kind of triggered me when you not triggered me. You reminded me of something when you said like our bodies and stuff as we. So, like making sure your bodies actually still function. Okay, and I'm speaking for guys. Could be girls too, but I'm a guy, so I'm going to speak from the guy's point. But if a guy's had medical issues, or he's had prostate cancer, or he's had other issues, and he's too afraid to say that he may suffer from ED, he might have to take the blue pill or something. I mean, those are discussions that should be had too, because I've heard some tragic things. I think I was in my 20s, and I remember a friend of the family or somebody had called, and there was a lot of crying on the phone. My wife was on the phone. And there was a lot of crying in the background. And it was somebody got married. They got on their honeymoon, and the guy couldn't perform. He had prostate cancer. And I felt bad. You're going to feel bad for the guy, but he didn't disclose that he could not get an erection. And the woman was just traumatized. She's like, I love this guy. I was so looking forward to our wedding night, and it's not going to happen.
That's hard. And I've been listening to Man Search for Meaning this last 2 weeks, and at the end he breaks it down into a lot of clinical psychiatric stuff. And I mean, we won't go down this path too much because it'll be a rabbit hole. But if the more there is hyper focus on performance, the harder it's going to be. But so I guess clinically, again, if there's okay, I'm trying to decide clinically or like morning wood, right? So if that's happening, it's healthy.
Yeah.
And if there's intimacy problems, it's more here. So I'll just leave that there so that we're not going down the path. But it is something that totally needs to be disclosed. If there is some erectile dysfunction or libido issues, or you're just not interested, or you have trauma, you do have to talk about that before you get too wrapped up or involved.
And I think it really comes down to basic honesty. Like, you know, like if someone if you've gotten that far in a relationship and they haven't disclosed that, there's going to be bigger problems than just that.
Right.
You know, because if they have not disclosed information, they've tried to trick you, whatever, it's bigger than just that one thing.
Yeah. And I agree with what David said. And again, okay, sorry. I know that clinically I might cross some lines here because I know this is also an LES podcast. I'm trying to find that space.
That's okay. We're all supposed to be adults and mature here. We
are all adults. So, but what David is saying is true. Like there are more than one way. There's more. If there is erectile dysfunction or something along those lines, as long as that's disclosed and then you communicate, we're going back to communication, right? Communicate. Okay, what other alternatives are there? Which of these alternatives are you open to? Because if your partner's not open to those, you're both going to be frustrated. So you do. So one, you need to be honest. Two, you need to communicate. So back to Jared. Yeah. And then, one thing I wanted to go back with Joyce too is finding about whether or not if you've never had sex, you don't know what to compare it to, is like if I think the best combination, whether you've had sex or not, if when you're together, it's hard to stop, but you both can stop, I think that is the best combination because you respect each other enough not to push each other's boundaries when you really want to rip each other's clothes off. So you should have that combination, right. And that's a really good combination.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, that's really good.
Well, there were just a couple of other in this little slide deck here. We talked about this one, sexuality is for building bonds of love between husband and wife. But I think this is a really beautiful concept here. Tenderness and respect, not selfishness, lead to holy sexuality. And I think that that's really true. Like as we really think about a good intimate relationship, it really has to start with that tenderness and respect, a love. And I mean, clearly we know there needs to be a spark and there needs to be some passion there. But I think that, you know, I think honestly, when it comes down to it, there has to be respect there. There has to be that love and that respect, and that, you know, when you approach it in that way, I think it can be really healthy and wonderful and beautiful, because it's supposed to be. The Lord did not create sex to be lurid and you know, and the way that Satan wants us to feel about it. He created it to be a beautiful experience between a man and a woman.
Yeah, I find it so surprising that Satan uses sexuality in a very perverse way, you know, and in a very enticing way, but then it can also cause people to be shamed by it and cause people to be ashamed by it. It's just, it boggles my mind, like how he can just pull that trick. It's like, okay, married couple, you know, this woman, she wants to cover her face during sex because she's ashamed of it. It's like, how did she get there? Like, how he just loves to mess with us, and he loves to take the thing that is probably the most important aspect of a relationship, procreation, you know, building that marriage bond, that love bond. Like, he wants to ruin it all. And so, yeah,
I agree.
So we're just about at time, but there was one question that I thought is interesting here. David is asking, is there such thing as a good girl syndrome within the church? And so I'm curious to know.
I don't know what that means. I saw that come up, and I was going to try to address it, but I don't know.
We need clarification on good girl.
Yeah,
I gotcha. Okay, because I was confused, and I'm like, you know, I'm not sure exactly what that means. So maybe we'll get some clarity. And I think that we can continue the conversation in a part 2. And that's what the captain says, who's behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Because we are really at time. But I think it's a great conversation. I think we'd also love to get comments from people on the Flameless Fireside Facebook page if people have thoughts or questions or things they'd like to kind of hear more about. But
so to David's clarification, he says good girls don't do certain things. I think, again, David, that goes back to communication. You need to have honest, transparent, sincere communication with, whoever you're dating. And if they don't want to do things you want to do, it's not a good match. If if you don't want to do things they want to do, it's not a good match. I don't know what the good girl syndrome is, but I don't know. It's communication.
It reminds me of an 80s song back in my day when they used to say, she's a woman on the streets and a freak in the sheets.
Well, the truth is, are there some people who suffer from a good girl syndrome where they feel like there are things they can't do because they're repressed and they didn't, yeah, of course there are. Whether most women in the church are that way, I couldn't speak to that. But are there women who are fearful of doing things that maybe aren't we're not supposed to do? Yeah, I think there probably are.
And I think it's prevalent in our culture and any strong Christian culture. And honestly, this is not to shame. It is to educate. They need to see a sex therapist or some type of other therapist because it's not healthy. It goes back to what Corey was saying, where they feel shame about something that's actually beautiful and authorized, So there shouldn't be shame around a healthy sexual relationship. So if there is, it does mean there needs to be some exploration therapy around it.
Yep.
Agreed.
Well, I think that was a good discussion tonight.
Agreed.
I think, go ahead.
I just posted the Zoom meeting ID. So for folks who would like to join us for the after party, you can join us at the Zoom link, which we posted in the comments. We'd love to have you. And, often in our after party, we continue the discussion. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just talk about whatever. But we'd love to have you join us. So,
yeah. Well, thank you, Katie, for joining us. I think having you on was perfect. I think it's exactly at the right balance.
Okay,
I think we had like the clinician, we had the guy, we had the girl, we had never been married, hasn't, different aspect of this of the single world, right? And then you had Katie and I who've been married, and then it's like the potato chips, right? You keep putting a bill of potato chips out. I know what potato chips taste like. I gotta keep away from the potato chips.
Right.
They're bad for me.
Well, just because you've never had the potato chips doesn't mean you don't want the potato chips.
So you're not going to totally love them, huh?
Exactly.
True.
They do look overboard. Like I'm just saying.
It does look delicious. It does look delicious. Well, thank you, Katie, for joining us, and thank you
for having
Joyce.
me.
Thanks, everybody.
And for all those that want to join the after party, you got the link in there, and we'll see you next week, everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much.